Hello, and welcome to today's roundtable with Dwayne Russell and Saul Newman. And today's roundtable is called Postanarchism and Subjectivity. And this is a topic that, for me personally, goes back to 2002, 2001 or so. And I had started a listserv actually on this topic. And I wrote a really brief kind of overview of what I was seeing happening in this field. And it's something that I'm not extremely into today, but it's a very interesting and ongoing thread that's really quite interesting. And so two of the main kind of prominent people who have been talking about this consistently throughout all that time, from the early 00s through the present, are Dwayne Russell and Saul Newman. Dwayne is a former student of Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek, and Saul Newman is a professor of political theory at Goldsmiths at University of London. And just try to figure out where that sound is coming from. If everyone could just actually mute yourselves until you're ready to speak, I'd appreciate that. Getting some kind of feedback. No big deal, but thanks. And Saul Newman's professor of political theory at Goldsmiths, University of London. And between the two of them, they'll be exploring different representations of post-anarchist political theory as a body of thought and practice, and aiming to identify what it is about anarchist political philosophy that makes it particularly relevant for contemporary politics and theory. Exploring the key ontological, epistemological, and meta-ethical issues within classical and contemporary literature of anarchism and post-anarchism, and indeed the merits of these designations, Russell and Newman will move on to explore the relevance, characteristics, and modes of recent developments in anarchist praxis, i.e. the futures of anarchist theory. Newman develops an original political theory of post-anarchism, a form of anti-authoritarian politics which starts rather than finishes with anarchy. And he does this by asking four central questions. Who are we as subjects? How do we resist? What is our relationship to violence, and why do we obey? By drawing on a range of heterodox thinkers, including Laboutie, Sorel, Benjamin, Stirner, and Foucault, Newman not only investigates the current conditions for radical political thought and action, but proposes a new form of politics based on what he calls ontological anarchy and the desire for autonomous life. Rather than seeking revolutionary emancipation or political hegemony, he suggests that we should affirm instead the non-existence of power and the ever-present possibilities of freedom. Russell provides an overview of post-anarchism and its key ontological, epistemological, and meta-ethical positions over the last 20 or 30 years. His highly contentious reading of the anarchist studies tradition demonstrates that its political commitments have been structurally and discursively determined by the unfolding of a precise logical movement. The next logical movement, according to Russell, is determined: a return to meta-ethical universalism, stripped of its hegemonic constraints, commitment, and grounded in metaphysical multiplicity. Russell's Lacanian anarchism engages the anarchist tradition while developing insights from the non-anarchist works of Slavoj Žižek, Alain Badiou, Levi Bryant, and others. So just say a little bit more about Saul Newman and Dwayne Russell. Saul is, as I said, a professor of political theory at Goldsmiths, University of London. He works in continental post-structuralist political and social theory, contemporary radical politics. He wrote the book From Bakunin to Lacan, which was from 2001. So that was one of the
Jason, someone muted you.
Okay, how long ago did that happen?
20 seconds ago.
Okay, thank you. Um, okay, so yeah, I was just going through Saul Newman's biography. Hi, who just muted me? Fadlan, where is Fadlan? I'm trying to find him. Fadlan, if you mute me again, I'm just going to kick you out. Okay? Can, can I hear you speak, please? Are you intentionally muting me or not? Okay, I'm gonna assume that was a mistake. If it happens again, you're out. Okay? I can't hear you. You're not saying anything, so there's no way to have a dialogue about it. Okay. Okay. So Saul Newman is a professor of political theory at Goldsmiths, University of London. He works in continental and post-structuralist political and social theory and contemporary radical politics. He's the author of From Bakunin to Lacan, Power and Politics of Post-Structuralist Thought, Unstable Universalities, and all three of those books I read quite closely, and they're all very good. Max Stirner, Politics of Post-Anarchism, and then most recently a book that is just titled, I believe it's just titled Post-Anarchism, and this one just came out. And it's kind of aimed at a more general audience. Duane Roussel is a former student of Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek. His most recent publications include After Post-Anarchism from 2012, Post-Anarchism, a Reader from 2011, The Subject of Change from 2012, and his latest book is, which he's currently working on, is Lacanian Realism, and that'll be coming out from Bloomsbury Press. And he also has a new edited forthcoming manuscript from Zizek, Alain Badiou, and Adrian Johnson about dealing with Lacan. So, so with that, let's just go ahead and get started, and I'll turn it over to Duane, and I think Duane's going to mostly facilitate, and then facilitate the overall structure of the meeting, and then him and Saul will be in dialogue, and we'll have some opportunity for collective dialogue between everybody, along with Saul and Duane as well. So I'll turn it over to Duane now.
We can't hear you.
Okay, how about now? Just sort of wave with your hand if you can hear me. Okay, great. Thank you, Jason, and I also want to thank Saul very much for doing this and joining us today. This is his new book here with Polity Press. I highly recommend you buy it. It's not very expensive, and it's a quick sort of read. I thought instead of making Saul wait, he can speak first, and I'll speak after that. Are you okay with that, Saul? You might need to be unmuted.
Mute myself, okay. Okay, is that better? Can people hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you.
Why can you not see me? Hang on, I need to...
Your camera might be off.
Let me just unclick. It seems to keep on going off and on for some reason. The red lights come on. My computer's just very slow here. Camera to usage. So no one can see me, but you can all hear me, is that right? Can everyone hear me? Okay,
Yeah.
good. Okay.
Now we can see you too.
You can see me too. Okay, very good. I can't see myself, but as long as you can see me, that's the main thing. So we have what 15 people here apparently, which is very nice. It's a bit like a kind of a union of egoists. It's a nice small number, I think, to talk about insurrection and so on. First, I'd like to say that this is a very exciting initiative. This new academy. It's great that these kinds of facilities exist with the wonders of modern technology, and I'm very happy to be part of it and to be talking about post-anarchism. So I'd like to thank the organisers for letting me be part of this, and also for the very generous introduction from Jason. I think, I don't know if my books are getting any better, but at least they the virtue of the title being much shorter, so it's gone from the politics of post-anarchism to anarchism itself. Look, what I'll probably do is talk for about half an hour, if that's okay, and I wanted to talk about one of the chapters of my book. As Jason was saying at the beginning, one of the questions which I ask is why do we obey? Why do we obey power? Why do we obey figures of authority, even when it's not in our interest to do so? I notice that one of the members of the audience is Etienne. Is that right? So one of the figures I'm going to be talking about tonight is Etienne de Lavoisier, who's one of the, as I said, one of the sitting had a big influence on me. His whole theory of voluntary servitude. So, I mean, before I start, I just want to say a bit about about sort of post-anarchism itself as a political theory. I mean, I suppose obviously it's very much inspired by some of the ideas of classical anarchism, but I think it does go beyond the parameters of 19th century classical anarchism. It's as much inspired by thinkers like Lavoisier, Foucault, George Sorel, and particularly Max Stirner, probably more so than it is by thinkers such as Bakunin, Kropotkin, Proudhon, Malatesta, and so on. So it's a different kind of anarchism. It starts from different premises. It starts from the basic premise of what I call ontological anarchism, which is an idea that I take from sort of the Heideggerian thinkers such as Rainer Sherman, for instance. I seem to be fading in and out. Is that right? Can people hear me okay?
No, it's pretty consistent.
Is it okay? Okay. Someone said I'm fading. So if I'm fading, I'll just try to talk a bit louder. Okay. So yeah. So what I want to do is really explore, as I said, one of the kind of the core sort of ethical values or assumptions, if you like, of post-anarchism, which is what I call voluntary inservitude. And this is obviously a kind of a reversal of the idea of Etienne de Lavoisier, the notion of voluntary inservitude. So it seems to me that one of the greatest obstacles to radical politics today is not the formidable nature of power, but rather our obedience to it. I think if we look at contemporary liberal or neoliberal regimes of power and what Foucault called governmentality, you have a situation where power operates not so much through outright coercion, although this is obviously present as well, but I mean primarily it's about encouraging certain forms of identification, passivity, performance behaviours and patterns of consumption and communication, and even I would say a kind of a desire for our own domination. And I think when we think about this, we sort of encounter one of the central enigmas and mysteries of political theory and indeed radical politics, which is why people obey even when it's clearly not in their interest to do so. And this, of course, is a very old problem, which was diagnosed by Lavoisier in the 16th century. And Lavoisier was, startled and confounded, if you like, by our passivity and our obedience in the face of tyrannical power. And he arrived, I think, at quite an astonishing conclusion, which was that, something I can see myself, which was that that all forms of power are essentially sustained. Okay, so the conclusion that he arrived at was that all forms of power are essentially sustained and indeed created by our voluntary submission. So I want to be, in a way, exploring his very well-known 16th century text, Discourse de la Servitude Volontaire. I want to try to develop from this, if I can, an alternative theory of freedom, or something which is closer to Max Stirner's idea of ownness, which I find quite an important idea. Okay, so it seems to me that when we think about freedom today and its centrality to any form of radical politics, we kind of arrive at something of a dead end. It seems that freedom is an increasingly opaque and obscure concept. And it's not quite clear whether people actually want to be free, right? I think the most superficial glance at the contemporary political world seems to reveal not so much a desire for freedom, but actually, on the contrary, a desire for authority, for a new figure of the master, if you like, right? And this, how else does one explain the return of fundamentalisms, the return of reactionary neo-fascist ideologies, demand for more law and order, more police power, tougher regimes of border restriction, more punitive measures, and so on, more surveillance. And this is what Deleuze and Guattari referred to as micro-fascism, which is a kind of a desire for one's own repression and a sort of a micro-authoritarianism which they believed permeated the social body, influencing everyday habits, behaviors, relations, and practices, and which they believed was present in both the politics of the right and the left, right? The left and the right. So the left-wing revolutionary politics is by no means immune, they argue, to micro-fascism. And of course, we can think about historical fascism here too, and if one reads the work of Wilhelm Reich and the mass psychology of fascism, Reich, of course, was a Freudian psychoanalyst who lived during those times, and he argued that the rise of Nazism couldn't be attributed to the Marxist theory of false consciousness, but actually came about from a sort of a real desire on the part of the masses for their own domination. And he believed this desire originated in sexual repression. I think that psychoanalysis can tell us quite a lot about the mysteries of voluntary obedience and this kind of desire for the master. And perhaps we can actually point to a kind of an authoritarian psychic structure which sort of underlies all social relations, and which he believed would pave the way for future fascist masters to emerge. But I think what I find curious about our contemporary democratic societies is that there's no longer any visible master to obey, and yet we continue to obey. Right? It's a nice quote from Giorgio Agamben from the book. Actually, he says, "We are," in quotes, "the most docile and cowardly social body that has ever existed in human history." Right? So, it would seem that the less visible structures of authority are, the less hierarchical society is. Paradoxically, the more we seem to obey, which I find that's a very interesting paradox in a way. Right? So the less visible power is, the less overt, the less hierarchically power is structured. And we don't live in, I don't think, hierarchical societies. I think the structure of power in our societies is, to some extent, democratic. Right. So in other words, there's no sort of clear, visible figure of a master anymore. Right, in democratic societies, but we continue to obey, and we obey the sort of dictates of the market. So behind perhaps the sort of the benign dictates of the market, or kind of the abstract authority of the law, we detect the hidden voice of command, which is all the more compelling for its obscurity and its opacity. Foucault makes the point that that neoliberal regimes of government intelligence govern us through our own freedom. They govern us in the name of our own freedom, right? So we're expected to freely obey through our everyday patterns of consumption and behaviour, communicating in certain kinds of ways, shopping, voting, enjoying in certain kinds of normalised and even in abnormal kinds of ways. Right. So it also seems to me that can no longer be attributed to sexual repression, as Reich believed. Today, it seems to me that it's liberal permissiveness itself, which kind of accompanies an increasing securitization of everyday life. Right, we live in societies which demand both private freedom, at least a kind of a commodified form of private freedom, and at the same time public order. So perhaps the sadness of our times lies in the fact that, at least in formerly democratic societies, there is no longer any figure of the tyrant who might otherwise serve as a kind of a cover or an excuse for our submission to neoliberal forms of economic and political power. So this problem of voluntary servitude, this problem of free voluntary obedience, surely raises quite significant questions, doesn't it, for radical politics, right? And particularly, I would say, for anarchism. I mean, anarchism is a political theory, a philosophy which assumes that we want to be free. It assumes that man is a being destined for freedom. There's a whole narrative, doesn't it, of throwing off the shackles of oppression, of human emancipation. There's a sense of optimism about the kind of the revolutionary tendencies of the masses, the desire for freedom on the part of the masses, and so on. So it seems to me that we need to very much question this narrative of emancipation and to ask whether or not it still works, whether or not it still operates in the same kind of way, and whether there is this kind of revolutionary desire for freedom within all of us, or on the contrary, something much more disturbing, which is a desire for our own repression. So here I want to turn to the text itself, the Discourse on Voluntary Servitude, or Discourse de la Servitude Volontaire, written by Boissy in 1548. Those of you who haven't heard of Boissy, of course, he was perhaps famous for being a friend and confidant of the French essayist and philosopher Michel de Montaigne. But he wrote this one essay which I think raises quite significant central questions for political theory. And his question was really quite simply, why do men obey? And I think it's worthwhile quoting him a bit here, just so you get a sense of the direction of his line of questioning. Let me just read out the quote. It says, "For the present, I should like merely to understand how it happens that so many men, so many villages, so many cities, so many nations sometimes suffer under a single tyrant who has no other power than the power they give him, who is able to harm them only to the extent that they have the willingness to bear with him, who could do them absolutely no injury unless they prefer to put up with him rather than contradict him. Surely a striking situation. Yet it is so common that one must grieve the more and wonder the less at the spectacle of 1,000,000 men serving in wretchedness their necks under the yoke, not constrained by a greater multitude than they, but simply, it would seem, delighted and charmed by the name of one man alone, whose power they need not fear, but he is evidently the one person whose qualities they cannot admire because of his inhumanity and brutality towards them." Okay, so Lavoisier, this problem of obedience, the obedience of the masses to the figure of one man or one individual is a real sort of mystery for Lavoisier. He says it's a kind of a moral sickness which we have to correctly diagnose. He struggles to kind of put his finger on it, he struggles to name it. He says it's not the same thing as cowardice, right? Because cowardice, while condemnable, while contemptible, it's at least understandable in some ways. But here, of course, the power imbalance between the masses and the single figure of the tyrant is so great that the cow simply doesn't account for the way in which the masses obey one person. Right. In other words, the point he's making, quite obviously, is it's the people, it's the masses who have the power, and yet they choose quite freely, quite willingly to give this power up to the one person who dominates them, who is brutal towards them, and so on. But the point is that this one figure is simply a creation of their own self-abandonment, the abandonment of their own will to be free. They could easily topple him almost without lifting a finger, but they choose not to. And he wants to try to understand why people make this choice. So for Lavoisier, freedom is our natural condition, right? He says that man is a being intended for freedom and for the enjoyments of the natural bonds of companionship and equality rather than the artificial bonds of power. And servitude is so far removed from our nature, according to Lavoisier, that even animals resist the slightest constraint on the freedom. But I think animals understand freedom better than we do, actually. We become domesticated, we become habituated to our own domination, the way in which animals do not. So I think in some ways we might regard Lavoisier as the anti-Hobbes. I characterize him as the anti-Hobbes. For Hobbes, as we know, freedom of the state of nature is a freedom which we suffer. It's a condition which, according to Hobbes, is highly unnatural to us because we simply cannot live in peace and security. So therefore, for Hobbes, the desire to move out of the state of nature, the desire to submit to absolute sovereign power, is an entirely natural and rational desire. Right? But for Lavoisier, of course, this whole rationalization of submission is precisely reversed. So we first enjoy freedom and equality, and indeed the plurality and the singularity which nature has endowed us with. And yet, for some reason, or on account of some historical misfortune, which she doesn't really explain, actually, we give it up, and we have sort of fallen into this condition of domination and powerlessness. Of course, Pierre Clastre, the anarchist anthropologist, wrote an essay on Lavoisier, and he kind of relates Lavoisier's argument to the loss of freedom in primitive societies, right? So in sort of primitive societies without a state, savage man, so-called savage man, tries very hard to prevent any kind of centralization of power because he knows that this power does become sort of constituted or instituted in kind of a fixed sort of way. This would be the downfall. This would be the end of his primitive freedom. But there's a point where savage man suddenly switches into or becomes part of the machine of domination, the state machine. And this is where primitive man regresses. He goes backwards. There's kind of a fall from grace. Right? So it's a similar sort of thing for Lavoisier. People suddenly switch quite voluntarily from freedom to servitude. But it seems to me that the ontological primacy of freedom is the important thing here. Right? The important thing is that we start with freedom and we end up with domination, and we will it. It's not something which is imposed upon us. It's something which we desire. So he says that our fall into servitude is something to do with kind of an apathy, a moral laziness, a moral languor, if you like. Something sort of comes over us, such as the no longer desire freedom and independence. But at the same time, what's interesting, I think, about Lavoisier is that our servitude is not passive, it's active. Our desire for servitude is active. It's something which we must sort of frenetically reaffirm every day. Someone said, not de Lavoisier, but the anthropologist, this is Pierre Clastre. Pierre Clastre. Are you familiar with him?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, good. Fine. Okay. So, what kinds of explanations does Lavoisier propose here? He proposes three possible factors which can explain this condition possibly. Firstly, he says that men or people become accustomed to servitude such that they forget they were ever free. He refers to a habituation to subjection. Secondly, he talks about the various kinds of spectacles of power, which kind of dazzle us, distract us, seduce us in various kinds of ways. Um, even though he's referring, for instance, to gladiatorial contests in ancient Rome, this is one of the examples of this. But it seems to me that the power of the spectacle is just as present in our own time today. I mean, there is a certain kind of magic of the spectacle, from the banalities of celebrity culture to the sort of the infantile excitement which accompanies the launch of the latest technological gadget, the latest iPhone, for instance. There's entertainment, sporting events, all of these kinds of contemporary spectacles, stupefy us in a similar sort of way to what Lavoisier is talking about, and they always, of course, serve the interests of power. Thirdly, Lavoisier shows how power constructs a certain kind of hierarchy of relations, right, in which the tyrant place is sustained by intricate networks and relations of dependency. Right, so we receive certain kinds of payoffs by being part of this, or imagined payoffs, if you like, by being part of this sort of pyramid of power. But obviously, it's a kind of a pyramid which ultimately enslaved us. That's one which we ourselves constructed. Okay, so that's his argument, right? I think it has a number of crucial implications, but I think it depends on what we take from it. So if we interpret Lavoisier as simply saying that we will always submit, that at every opportunity we will throw ourselves at the feet of power, at every opportunity we'll kind of cut our own throat, then the argument doesn't really get us very far, and I think even gives rise to a certain sort of conservatism which says that that men or people are born to submit. But I think we should perhaps read it in another way, which is closer to Lavoisier's own intentions. Which is to say, it's in a kind of should be read in sort of an emancipatory sense. It's a kind of a way of rousing us, or waking us from this sort of sleep that we're in, this kind of enfeebled, servile state. And Lavoisier confronts us with, I think, a very startling truth, and this truth is this: that if we have freely chosen servitude, if we've freely chosen to participate in our own domination, then this means that all power is essentially an illusion, right? It's something which we have created, something which we have constructed. It means that, in a way, power doesn't exist, that the tyrant, or whatever structure of power we serve under, that we submit to, is something which we've created, and therefore the only power which it has is power which we have endowed it with through our own voluntary self-abandonment. Right? So the tyrant's power is simply illusory. It's an illusion, according to Lavoisier. It's only our power in an alienated form. Okay? So all power, it seems to me, and I think this is the fundamental lesson we should take from Lavoisier, all power is our power. And domination is only possible. Domination is only possible through our continued submission, but it's continuous sort of offering of ourselves up to power. And it seems to me that this realization makes power quite unstable as a relationship. All we need to do is sort of peer through the veils of power to see its emptiness, its impotence. I mean, I'm almost thinking actually of the Gandhi's, the Gandhi book, The Kingdom of the Glory, as this kind of metaphor of the empty throne of power, which was sort of hidden behind certain kinds of political and theological veils and psychological guises. But when you sort of peer through this, you see that the throne is empty, right? In a way, the power does not exist. It's kind of a sort of an empty place of power. And so this is the kind of the lesson I would take from Lavoisier. So the point is that if we want to free ourselves from power, we simply need to take it back. Or even more simply, Lavoisier says it's not even so much a question of taking it back, it's simply a question of no longer, or stopping the giving of ourselves up to the power of the tyrant. Right? to stop this kind of continual repetition of the behaviours of submission. So it's no longer, it's not so much a question of even overthrowing the tyrant, it's a question of no longer empowering him and instead of empowering ourselves. You know, and when you do that, when you simply turn your backs on power, right, the tyrant or any structure of power actually simply collapses. So, you know, Lavoisier wants people to kind of recall to themselves their own power. He wants us to kind of remind ourselves. He wants to remind us that we had the power all along. We just simply didn't know it. He offers us no revolutionary program because none are needed. Right? He simply wants us to kind of emancipate ourselves. And I think, you know, here there's certainly a connection really with Stirner's notion of the insurrection, which once again is very different from the revolution. It's not about kind of revolutionary programs. It's not about you know, vanguard parties kind of leading the masses to a revolution. It's about people emancipating themselves by, in a sense, reaffirming their own power, by sort of reasserting themselves. You know, he talks about the working forth of me out of the established. You know, upon which power itself, the structure of power, simply disappears. It simply collapses. I think this is a very simple, interesting idea. Okay. So I think perhaps the idea that we can take from this is that, and this is what I refer to in the book as a kind of an indifference to power, a politics of indifference to power, which is that we, in doing this, we kind of give ourselves the freedom to act as though power no longer existed. Right? So, you know, Stirner's insurrection and, you know, the kind of civil disobedience which Lavoisier talks about are, I think, forms of politics which lay bare or make visible, render visible the great secret of power, which is its own non-existence. Right? So the fundamental lesson, I think, of Lavoisier and Stirner, even though they're of course very different things, is that power does not exist. But I mean, to say that it doesn't exist, or to say that power is an illusion, doesn't mean that, you know, power has no effects. You know, illusions have all kinds of concrete effects, right? But rather, it's to say that power has no power over us. Sorry, it was indifference to power, the indifference to power, acting as though power does not exist. Okay, now, this idea of the non-existence of power, I think, is also a theme analysed by, or pursued by Foucault. Of course, you know, for Foucault, the key thing is the sort of the indeterminacy and historical contingency of power relationships. So Foucault tells us that, you know, there is no such thing as power with a capital P. Right? The power in itself has no essence. The power is not a substance, but a relation. It's not a property, it's an intensity. And even in you know, conditions of domination and oppression, there's always the possibility of resistance and the possibility of freedom. So the effect of this is in a sense to kind of strip power of its various abstractions and to reveal the secret of freedom which power is founded upon. Right? So, you know, what's interesting is that Foucault is always read as a kind of a theorist of power, theorist of governmentality. But, you know, the key question for Foucault, of course, was, you know, how not to be governed. This is one of the you know, the thing that he refers to, the question of how not to be governed. Right? So Foucault's insight, of course, was that every system of power was fragile and haunted by the prospect of its own reversal and disappearance. So we shouldn't think about power in terms of mastery and domination, but rather as kind of an unstable, impermanent set of relations and interactions. You know, in one of Foucault's lectures called "What is Critique," which he gave at the Sorbonne in 1978, he talks about you know, regimes of power, knowledge, and truth as a kind of a sort of a historical event, rather than a structure which is in any sense you know, inevitable or transcendental. And Interestingly, in this very lecture, he kind of directly invokes Lavoisier here, although he kind of reverses the phraseology and says, in quotes, critique will be the art of voluntary inservitude, of reflexive indocility. Voluntary inservitude and reflexive indocility. Okay, so what does Foucault mean by this? I mean, he says that all systems of power, as I said, are events without any kind of transcendental essence or origin, and therefore without any kind of real unity or legitimacy, and they only become hegemonic through our free acceptance of them. Right. So once again, I think Foucault is kind of pointing to this notion of voluntary servitude. Right, that a system of power becomes hegemonic only because we, for some reason, submit to it. We allow ourselves to be subjectified by it. What this really means, seems to me, is that freedom. What's the freedom to submit, but also the freedom to not submit, is the ontological basis of all power. Right? And once again, this is one of the sort of the ways of approaching the notion of ontological anarchy, which is sort of a theme that I've traced throughout the book. You have to be able to discern the murmur of freedom, or the yet sort of unrealized, yet always potentially realizable freedom, which, if you like, speaks to us incessantly through the cracks within power. So rather than power being the secret of freedom, as Foucault is often interpreted as saying, it seems to me that freedom is the great secret of power. Right? So what that means is that if every system of power depends upon our will, our acceptance, our voluntary acceptance, or our voluntary servitude, to use Lavoisier's terms, this means that the undoing and the reversal of every system of power is equally a matter of will, of decision, and of volition. So Foucault refers in this lecture to the decisive will not to be governed. Right? The decisive will not to be governed. So, I mean, what we're talking about here is, think about freedom in terms not of some sort of abstract goal to be achieved, not as a kind of a program of revolutionary liberation. It's not something which is articulated through a certain pattern of social organization. It's a kind of freedom which we always already have. Right? This is what I mean by ontological freedom. It's a freedom which we always already have. We always have the capacity for freedom. Right? And so for Foucault and for Lavoisier, it's a matter of recalling this, of bringing this back to memory, reminding ourselves of the power which seems to overwhelm us at times, at the same time depends upon our own acquiescence, our own consent, and all that's required is to overturn this relationship is the willing of our own freedom. Now, I mean, just going back to Lavoisier for a moment, it seems to me there's nothing anachronistic about Lavoisier's text, even though it was written at least over 400 years ago, 450 years ago. I mean, the classic figures of tyrants that he refers to, from ancient Greece and Rome and so on, are much less important than this kind of subjective mechanism or the strange desire which kind of binds us to power. And it seems to me that this strange desire is all the more pertinent today as a sort of analytical tool or analytical device for thinking about the way in which regimes of neoliberal governmentality operate. They operate, as I said, through self-subjection. Okay. So anyway, so I think you have to get the point about voluntary servitude and its reversal, which is voluntary inservitude. I now want to talk about discipline, because even though it might seem a bit paradoxical that an anarchist is interested in discipline, I think that it's impossible for us to be free without discipline. So what do I mean by discipline? How can we have a kind of an anarchist or a post-anarchist understanding of discipline? Okay, so one of the questions I have about voluntary servitude is, sorry, before I get on to that, I mean, firstly, I would say that this kind of release from voluntary servitude that Stirner and perhaps in the way Foucault is talking about is not a purely sort of individual enterprise. It's something which is practiced, and I emphasize the word practice, it's something which is practiced associatively. Right? At the same time, of course, Max Stirner was very skeptical about collective forms of politics, of course. He thought there was always a risk of the collective kind of overwhelm the individual egos, which is why he proposed ideas such as the union of egos, which was a sort of an open and entirely contingent political formation, which the kind of individual egos could sort of join and leave as and when he or she wished. And even though the whole notion of the union of egos might sound sort of self-contradictory and paradoxical, I think forces us to somehow think the individual with the collective, the individual in and through the collective. In other words, to kind of imagine alternative forms of political association, which allow us to act collectively, but which at the same time don't sort of smother or crush the individual. I think this is very sort of interesting and suggestive. Okay, so let's go back to discipline for a moment. So our release from voluntary servitude requires discipline, right? But what I'm talking about, obviously, here is not a sort of discipline which is imposed by revolutionary vanguard or a leadership of that kind. I'm talking about a form of self-discipline. And this comes back to the problem of the will, right? So if, as Lavoisier says, all that's required for people to release oneself from this sort of enthrallment to the tyrant is the will to be free. The question is, where does this will come from? How do we generate it? If we've become, habituated to domestication and to servitude, such that we've actually forgotten what freedom means, how do we recall the will? How do we sort of summon up the will to think and act differently? And here I would be very careful about the notion of spontaneity. I know that the idea of being spontaneous is a very anarchistic sounding thing, but it seems to me that we're just as likely to spontaneously obey as to spontaneously rebel. Right, so I think we need to think a bit more creative than simply saying, let's sort of act spontaneously. I mean, it's extremely ambivalent, actually. Okay, so in breaking the spell of domination, for Lavoisier, of course, it's equally a matter of breaking with certain patterns of action and behaviour, as well as inventing new ones. So sometimes for Lavoisier, it's simply a matter of stopping or discontinuing our action, right? Because it's our frenetic sort of continuity of our act of obedience which kind of sustains the power of the child. So sometimes we just simply have to stop empowering them. But even this is not a passive gesture. On the contrary, I think it requires a sort of a willful and conscious expression of a different and more autonomous way of life. So we have to acquire a certain kind of self-discipline. I mean, Georges Sorel, for instance, talks about the way that the proletariat has to learn new habits of liberty. We have to learn how to be free. We have to learn certain habits and certain behaviours such that they become sort of inculcated within us. Richard Flathman, the American political philosopher, whom I also talk a bit about in the book, argues that without discipline, there's no possibility of agency, therefore no possibility of freedom. Right? So for Flathman, disciplinary limits have to be present within the individual, and indeed even, he actually says, even outside the individual, if you like, freedom to be sort of tested and measured against agonistically. Right? But what he's really getting at is the fact that within oneself, there's tendencies, desires and dependencies which make you more susceptible to the power of others. I mean, this also, I suppose, goes to Foucault's notion of ascesis, the ethics of the care of the self within the cultures of ancient Greece and ancient Rome. what ascesis involves are certain forms of alert self-discipline, such that we can control our own tendencies, such that we can, in other words, gain a certain mastery over oneself in the interests of one's own freedom. Right? So these practices that I'm getting at, practices of ascesis, of self-discipline, are ethical. And they're ethical in the sense that they concern not only oneself, but also how one relates to others. You know, we have to remember that for the ancient Greeks, for instance, the point Foucault also makes, you know, the desire to exert excessive power over others, the desire to dominate others, is a sign of weakness rather than strength. Right? The tyrannical desire is, the tyrannical desire is a sign of loss of self-control. It's an indication that you are not master of yourself and you've become intoxicated with your own appetite for power. I mean, as Rousseau, for instance, knew full well, if one desires to dominate others, one is much more likely to be dominated by others. So in other words, the desire to dominate others and the desire for one's own domination are simply two sides of the same coin, quite interestingly. And also, I think we find this reflected in Stirner's notion of ownness, which is a very key concept for Foucault's, Stirner's egoist. So in ownness, ownness is not this kind of crude, egoistic desire to exercise power over others. I mean, on the contrary, I think what we find in Stirner is this kind of extreme sensitivity to the dangers posed to one's own autonomy by by the temptation of what he calls possessiveness, right? Being possessed by others, or being possessed by external objects which have become internalized, or being possessed by certain kinds of desires, a desire for power, for wealth, for whatever, which somehow takes over one's own subjectivity. And if we can't gain any distance from our desires such that they can be mastered, then our desires simply master us, and we have no freedom, and we have no autonomy. Right, so I think that's a very important point. I mean, what Stirner is also getting at in his own sort of way is this notion of, you know, self-discipline, mastering oneself, you know, without which, once again, there is no possibility of freedom. So the lesson here, I think, from all of these things I've been talking about, you know, Foucault, Lavoisier, Max Stirner, is that one plays the dangerous game of power, excuse me, always at one's own cost. You know, we have here a number of, you know, practices, ethical practices, I would say, and indeed even political practices of freedom through self-mastery and discipline, and also sort of ethics, and indeed I would say politics of non-domination. So freedom, or as I prefer to call it, ownness, I think freedom's we've been referring to freedom, I think we need to perhaps use a different term these days for freedom. I prefer to call it ownness. Freedom or ownness is a release from voluntary servitude. It's a discipline, it's an art, it's something which is learnt, something which we learn from others, and even teach oneself, something which we have to work at, which we have to fashion, which we have to practice, patiently elaborate. And we practice this, you know, not only in relation to oneself, but in relation to others, as I said. So it's kind of a work upon our own limits, not only external limits, but also, more importantly, our internal limits. Right? But the point is that freedom is our ever-present possibility, and indeed our ontological condition and our point of departure. And the realization and the affirmation of ontological freedom, coupled with its ethical responsibilities, I think is the, as I said, the central motif, or the central sort of ethico-political core of post-anarchist political theory. And I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. I'm getting a lot of feedback, actually, so if everybody can mute their mic. So what I think we'll do is hold off on discussion until after my presentation, and then I'll ask people to Saul's presentation. I'm taking my headphones out simply because I'm getting a lot of feedback. So I'll look at them
actually,
as people are talking.
Saul, could you
by making
could
a
you
fairly
could you
blanket
mute your
statement.
microphone,
I think
please?
most of the people in this virtual room could agree
Saul,
with, which is that we have
you mute your
entered
microphone,
a sort of
please?
a new moment of anarchist theory and thinking. We have a new signifier. We call it anarchist studies.
Saul,
And
could you please mute your
I
microphone?
mean, I don't have the statistics, but I don't think we can deny that there are more anarchist studies professors or professorships than ever before in history. There are more doctoral students defending dissertations.
Yes, I know. I'm clicking on it.
Anarchist studies, scholars in
okay.
studies position, and we can go through and list them off. And there are more anarchist studies manuscripts being published in university presses. So, sorry, everybody can hear me, right?
No.
Wave if you can hear me.
I can hear you, but
Yes, Saul can hear you fine because he's on his own computer, but for everybody else, it's causing a feedback loop. So we need to figure out how to mute his microphone. I'm pressing mute on his microphone, and it's not allowing me to. It looks like it might be muted now. Do you want to try and speak, Dwayne?
Sure. Is this okay? Can everybody hear me?
Yeah. I think it ended up getting muted, so I think it's working now.
Okay.
And just so you know, we basically missed everything you said.
Oh, that's okay. I was just okay. So I was just making a sort of blanket statement that I think everybody in the room can agree with, just on the current state of anarchist theory and the way anarchist studies has become a sort of new signifier, something new that everybody's talking about. I would say that I would agree with the Randall Amster and his co-editors of the volume Contemporary Anarchist Studies when they claimed, and I'm going to quote them, that there has been growing interest in anarchism as it is expressed through scholarly work from Ivy League to community colleges. Anarchist professors and scholars studying anarchism and anarchist movements are increasingly present in the academy. End quote. And we can go on. I mean, for example, one of the world's most cited philosophers, Judith Butler, recently gave a talk on anarchism at the New School for Social Research in New York, and so on and so on. So all of these examples, I think, demonstrate that the critical discourse of anarchism has forced its way into the university. So I think that anarchist studies discourse has a place within the university, not only because the university aims to recuperate exceptional knowledges, which is a point that I'm going to try and make throughout this talk, but also because the former is what Lacan might have called a metonymy of university discourse. Metonymy in this sort of Lacanian, strictly Lacanian sense, functions through displacements of lack. Lack being a key concept in the Lacanian vernacular. So displacements of lack across a chain of signifiers. So this is the discourse's pretense of novelty, I think. We're dealing here with a type of novelty that is supported by the succession of a signifying chain, such that another signifier, it's always another signifier, in this case it's anarchist studies, can be added to the stack. Lacan wrote that, quote, metonymic structure is the signifier-to-signifier connection that allows for the illusion which the signifier instates lack of being via the resistance of signification. So this is also the logic of desire, in as much as logic is, or desire is itself a metonymy. Lacan said desire is always a desire to desire, and desire is also always the desire of the big other. So in other words, anarchist studies is the metonymy of university discourse because the former is the condition for the continuation of the desire of the latter. So I think and this is a case I'm slowly trying to make. You might disagree with me, but I think anarchist study is ultimately a mode of insertion which renews what Jacques-Alain Miller and the early 1950s and 60s Lacanians would have called the suturing apparatus of the university, or the university discourse. So it's not, as David Graeber and many others have claimed, a mode of desertion from the signifying structure of the university. So before I go further, I want to make a key distinction. Anarchist discourse is not structurally equivalent to anarchist studies discourse. But I think in the contemporary period, the former is nonetheless at risk. So the question is, at risk of what? I think it's at risk of turning into the latter, that is, of passing through what some Lacanian clinicians refer to as a moment of obsessionalization, which is characteristic of university discourse. So anarchist discourse has exhibited classically hysterical structure, I maintain. Alienated subjects, lumpen, peasants, proletarians, and so on, acted out failed revolutions, thereby revealing what Freud would have called the desire for an unsatisfied desire, and interrogated a few figures of mastery. So there's capitalism, the state, the church, and later I think patriarchy, and so on, and the list kept growing. So they provoked their masters so as to produce new significations in the form of morals, egalitarian political and economic arrangements, and so on. And I think the Spanish Revolution demonstrates here a point that was made by Lacan, that hysterical acts occur when the subject reaches the anxiety point, which lies at the level of the big other. But nonetheless, Murray Bookchin claimed, and I'm quoting him, that the Spanish Revolution was the farthest reaching movement that the left ever produced, end quote. I don't think he could bring himself to admit that this revolution was also a profound failure. It was a sort of revolution without revolution. It was ultimately a short-lived and inconsequential civil war against nationalists and fascists. So perhaps it's a really risky hypothesis to be making within this crowd, probably, but perhaps it's the case that the Spanish uprising was ultimately conservative in orientation. So to put it another way, fascism was the agent of the revolutionary uprising, and it alone was responsible for provoking otherwise scattered and disorganized peasants into collective formation. So the supposed revolutionary acts of the Spanish peasants and communists, I don't think could be described as spontaneous or autonomous, because they didn't occur during a moment of political stability. Rather, they were a structural response to a structural or a shifting political and economic structure, which is, of course, fascism. Fascism being the ultimate source or structure of mastery. So, no wonder then Pablo Picasso, just 1 year after the uprising in 1937, completed his Guernica, depicting the colorless suffering of bodies torn limb from limb. Beneath, if you look at the painting, you'll see a sort of all-seeing eye of the big other. Partial objects shooting this way and that, which is akin to Hegel's description of the night of the world. He says, here shoots a bloody head, there another white ghastly apparition. The world of partial objects surrounds the pure ontological dimension of the subject, the latter of which is, and here I'm quoting Hegel again, this night, this empty nothing that contains everything in its simplicity. That's Hegel, that's not even Stirner. But in place of this darkness of the subject, there are illuminated white and gray limbs, about which Lacan dedicated so much ink. He said, the fragmented body is regularly manifested in dreams when the movement of an analysis reaches a certain level of aggressive disintegration of the individual. It then appears in the form of disconnected limbs or of organs exoscopically represented, growing wings and taking up arms for internal persecutions that the visionary Hieronymus Bosch fixed for all time in painting. And here he's referring to the Garden of Earthly Delights painting posted in the Facebook group. So these depictions of partial objects are implicated in hysterical structure, and they demonstrate this sort of touch of masochism prevalent in hysterical symptoms. So I think the lesson is actually quite instructive. The hysterics discourse only further implicates her in the problem of mastery. This is something I think we're all fully aware of, people who have been reading post-anarchist writing for some time, people who are familiar with Lacanian theory. Bruno Bostiels puts it really clearly. He says, mastery and hysteria would thus appear to be codependent. And of course, Lacan, in his impromptu presentation to revolutionaries at the experimental university, said, quote, if you had a bit of patience, I would tell you that, always, the revolutionary aspiration has only a single possible outcome, of ending up in the master's discourse. This is what experience has proved. What you aspire to as revolutionaries is a master. You will get one, end quote. So the hysteric, unlike the agent of university discourse, stages a confrontation with her master without realizing that this is the deadlock of mastery within which her desire is implicated. I think actually Saul Newman put this really well 10, 12 years ago in his essay on Lacanian, the four Lacanian discourses, when he said, quote, just as the hysteric sees the master as the cause of her alienation, so the anarchist sees the state as the cause of the subject's alienation. Anarchism finds itself, paradoxically, reliant upon the state in order to form its own revolutionary identity, end quote. So the hysteric partakes in this extensive masquerade. It's because of not having power and mastery, which is structurally equivalent to not having the phallus, that the anarchist pretends to be autonomous and revolutionary, which is structurally equivalent to being the phallus. So I raise a really controversial question, which is it any wonder then that Emma Goldman refused to let go of her anarchist identity for the sake of sort of revolutionary, pragmatic gains? I'm quoting from her autobiography, my own life was full of misery. I went in search of a room, but my name seemed to frighten the landlords. My friends suggested that I give an assumed name, but I would not deny my identity, end quote. So she's not denying her identity. She refuses to deny her identity, and she doesn't want to deny the sort of pure morals that that identity represents, no matter how terrible the consequences, even if it means homelessness. On another occasion, when Emma Goldman was working the streets as a prostitute, she was inclined to reveal her true identity, but only to one particular man, because he seemed vaguely sympathetic to her plight. And if you read her autobiography with an eye for this sort of stuff, I think you'll also notice that the way she describes her relationship to her landlord is no different structurally than the way she'll describe her relationship to the state or to capitalism and so on. In the end, we're told, she tells us, that she was forced to produce a fictitious name and hide her identity from the landlords. This finally permitted her to obtain a room of her own, but only by sacrificing, and here I'm using her words, the loss of my identity. Broadly speaking, I think this is similar in effect to the sacrifice that one always has to make when one enters the symbolic order and undergoes castration. But I don't think we should be too quick to dismiss what she has to say. It was, when you're reading the autobiography, one of the darkest moments in the book, and it's a very large book. And I think we're led to experience it precisely as a truly dark moment. But the better days that she described were those of August 1893 in Philadelphia, when, as Goldman put it, the police were hunting for her. So the question I'm asking then is, why did Goldman feel most fiercely at home precisely when she didn't have a room of her own? And then there's something further that we might want to contemplate. Goldman, when she was working working the streets, She was approached by a man who was interested not in her body, but in her well-being. It was at this moment that she finally gave a hint of who she was, and by way of what I would call a sort of nice bit of canned knowledge of the oppressed. I'm quoting a dialogue. He asked, "You're a novice in this business, aren't you?" "Yes, this is my first time." He understood that I was inexperienced. Whatever might have been the reason that brought me to the street, he knew it was not mere looseness or love of excitement. "But thousands of girls are driven by economic necessity," I blurted out. He looked at me in surprise. I wanted to tell him all about who and what I was, end quote. So he looked at her in surprise. Those of you who are familiar with Lacan's writing, or even Freud's writings, will immediately recognize this as a key moment, a moment that is reminiscent of Freud's case of the young homosexual woman, as he calls it. But why did she feel that he looked at her in surprise? I think it was perhaps because she thought that he should not at all expect a prostitute to express these articulate and lovely things. He understood, he knew, but what? He knew, I claim, somehow, who she really was. And because he knew, he could solve her own enigma, the enigma of her desire. So again, I think this is all actually really quite good, and what she had to say about the exploitation of women is absolutely correct. It was just as correct as what Anna O and Dora were saying, and they expressed equally truths that I think we should listen to. But our task, I think, is rather to understand the discourse from which she spoke, not to judge, but to understand the discourse. So I think finally we arrive at what I call a foundational question hidden within anarchist discourse. What am I to the big other? It's shrouded in no less revealing questions. What am I to the bourgeoisie? What am I to the state? What am I to the Marxists? And so on. I think it mirrors perfectly the hysterical foundational question concerning gender. Am I a man or am I a woman? The hysterical neurotic frequently believes that the answer concerning the mystery of her sexual identity can be found in a body of knowledge. And this is why Lacan placed S2 in the position of product in the hysterics discourse. The anarchist rephrases, am I a master or am I a slave? The hysteric's endless attempt to show her stuff to the master, or else to provoke the master to show his stuff, only perpetuates the signifying chain of university discourse, which in turn perpetuates the discourse of mastery. So the battle endlessly circulates then between demonstrating a certain victimization at the hands of power, for example, and demonstrating self-mastery or autonomy. Whereas university discourse recuperates surplus knowledges into the fold of banal academic knowledge without realizing that this serves a master. The hysteric produces knowledge, whether banal or novel, precisely because of her desire for mastery. So truth slips out during moments of abnegation. Lacan, when interpreting Freud's conception of abnegation, explained, quote, "It is the phenomenon by which the subject reveals one of his impulses in his very denial of it, and at the very moment at which he denies it. The most common expression of this form, don't think that, ... already points to the profound relationship with the other," end quote. So the anarchist will often claim that she's anti-capitalist, anti-state, anti-this, anti-that, but I think it's a sort of roundabout way of expressing the following. Don't think that I am a statist. Don't think that I am a capitalist, and so on. So in any case, many times neurotic abnegation appears as if it were under another structure, namely perverse disavowal. I think we need to distinguish between the statement, don't think that, ... and I know very well but, ... For example, it's common for anarchists to preface their scholarly work in a way that appears to me as quite perverse. I'm just going to quote a short passage from Richard Day's book, Gramsci is Dead. Richard, by the way, is a very good friend of mine, so I'm not trying to stick it to him like his hysterical counterpart. He says, "It is important that I identify myself as a white male university professor living and working in the relative ease and comfort of a G8 country. I know that my own socialization and the racist and patriarchal norms that permeate the academic world make it relatively easy for me to stay in the game. The same goes for my sexuality," end quote. And he goes on for, I think, a full page, this sort of stuff. And around the time this was written, I think it was 2006 or around this time, many books had these sort of prefaces. Perverse disavowal functions, according to Freud, by negating the perceptual awareness of reality, or to be more precise, of castration, and replacing it with an affirmation within the register of conscious knowledge. In the case of the sadist, the pervert disavows the reality of the lack in the other, that the other is himself lacking, the big other, authority figures, and so on. Or in the case of the masochist, he disavows the reality of the lack in himself, the fact that he is not a master of his own discourse. In other cases, he continues to act as if lack were not present. Consequently, he attempts at all costs to produce this missing lack, and his surest indication of success is the signal of anxiety. Okay, we can go through and list a whole bunch of things that are very obviously resemble perverse structure within anarchist discourse and practice. And to make matters even more confusing, there's that hint of masochism prevalent in hysteria, which can deceive us of the true structure of the subject. But I've been involved in anarchist practice and studies and theory for 20 years and or more, and it brings me to presume that I think perversion cannot possibly be the dominant structure, and I think it's for a really important reason. The pervert, unlike the neurotic, lacks a question which the anarchist is never without. So the neurotic lacks many things, but she's never without her foundational question. The operation of repression and denial ensures that she knows too much. As they say, she knows more than she knows, or she doesn't know what she knows, these sorts of things. So the neurotic negates not necessarily the reality of castration like the pervert, but the truth of her unconscious, the truth of the big other, and of structural lack. She doesn't attempt to install lack within a structure that seems to be lacking it, wherein lack is lacking, as they say, and to thereby conjure the affect of anxiety. Rather, the neurotic forever attempts to flee from the proximity of lack and the anxiety that brings along with it. And for the neurotic, then, this sort of lack is not something that needs to be installed, but it's something that never ceases not being written by the symbolic order of signifiers. Proudhon, the anarchist, wrote, quote, "Man rouses from his idleness only when want fills him with anxiety," end quote. See, I think at one time, anarchist theorists were capable of saying these really remarkable, profound truths like that. Lacan, who admired Proudhon's work quite a bit and spoke about it often in his seminars, claimed that, quote, "Anxiety is the signal of defense against a certain lack," or "anxiety is a signal of the real." So the neurotic is cowardly when the analyst offers the opportunity for courage. Courage, then, is, I would claim, one of the key ingredients of analytic discourse. And it means that in the final instance, the analytic discourse must also be read as a movement through two obstacles to arrive at something like something new, like a new body of knowledge or a new body in terms of a new political or economic organization, and so on. So the two obstacles, if you could see the analyst discourse, I have it here. If you can't see it, I'll just read it. It begins with objet A, passes through the obstacle of the barred subject, S barred, through the obstacle of mastery, finally to arrive at S2, a new body of knowledge, which is in the position of truth. So I think this is what Stirner was hinting at when he said, only when a human feels lost and alone, like the objet A, will his courage swell, and will he realize who he is and the power he possesses, end quote. Courage for Alain Badiou is, quote, an affect which goes against anxiety, end quote. But it doesn't go against anxiety in the sense of fleeing from it into emotion, turmoil, acting out, embarrassment, or passage à l'acte. Passage à l'acte. This is a point I think made especially clear in Lacan's 10th seminar when he said that we need to know how to come to terms with anxiety. Badiou, continuing his little theory of courage, said, courage is what gives the human animal the means to go beyond anxiety. It is the very core of subjectivation. So I think this returns us to the question of the hysteric, of the anarchist. What we as anarchists are most incapable of doing, I think, is recognizing in our ostensibly courageous political acts a tendency to flee from anxiety. So when Alfredo Bonanno chants, all that is left to do is destroy them. Attack now, not in the future, now, sabotage now, and on and on. I think there's something else going on here. The anarchist often refuses to wait, to use a favorite expression of some of the insurrectionary anarchists and of Derek Shannon and others, not because he has abolished the big other courageously, but rather precisely because of the big other, to whom this refusal, this refuse, objet petit a, is ultimately offered. So again, if you look at the structure of the hysterics discourse, up here, you probably can't see it, but objet A is brought to the master. Now, on the other hand, the obsessional anarchist quite often recognizes, whether explicitly or implicitly, that he is a coward. But he nonetheless attempts to conceal this insight through his very cowardly abnegations. And here I'm linking obsession with university discourse. I think the two are basically the same. So he thereby makes a pretense at mastery by making a prop out of courage in the play on the stage for the big other. Analytic discourse again adds an essential element, which is the theory of courage, and this revolutionizes the university and hysterical discourses. The neurotic anarchist does not continue to push back the line of armor-clad police officers, like the pervert, but rather demonstrates that he is perfectly following the law. And that, on the contrary, it's the police and the state who refuse to abide by the law, and by the true law. So the law here, in the anarchist conception, may refer to the law of the people, the law of the state, international law, moral law, or more than likely, natural law. So for example, Bakunin wrote that, quote, a large number of natural laws remain unknown to the masses. Once they shall have passed into the consciousness of all, the question of liberty will be entirely solved, end quote. I don't think Bakunin was ready for the contemporary period, this period in which we're in, this hyper-mediated Facebook world where I think we are all basically part of a popular anti-capitalism. So for example, I think everybody knows very well, this is sort of Zizek's line, that Facebook profits off of our enjoyment, Gmail no doubt, and off of our posts and likes, and yet we nonetheless return to it each day. I think we could even go so far as to claim that today we're basically all consciously anti-capitalist. And this is what precisely maintains the drive of capitalism to repeat itself. This idea that we're all anti-capitalist, by the way, it was actually a headline in the New York Times in 2014. So I don't think it's that far-fetched. And I think it helps to explain the loss of the militant figure of the anarchist theorist, like Proudhon, replaced as he is by the militant anarchist historian, or the militant anarchist professor, that's us. Perhaps we are all structurally oppressed by capitalism and therefore structurally anti-capitalism. This would be the line in Lacan's formula of sexuation on the masculine side where he says all X are submitted to castration. But it comes with the exception the exception of the 1% who remain absolutely capitalist. This would be there exists at least one who is not submitted to castration. So the problem for me continues to be, how do we revolutionize the structure of discourse, the structure itself, so that we are not only consciously anti-capitalist, but also actively anti-capitalist? And I don't think it's an easy question to answer, obviously. But just to finish up, I think it's worth saying that in the obsessional mode, the neurotic demonstrates his good intentions to the master, or perhaps he demonstrates his own mastery. But he does it to conceal the truth of his utterances. You know, although I am a white male university professor, ... This is the demonstration of knowledge and good intentions. Please allow me to continue for the rest of the book, ... So you'll also often read within the first paragraph of a contemporary anarchist studies textbook something like, quote, littered with misconceptions about violence and chaos, anarchism in actuality has little to do with either, end quote. So here we can see that the anarchist scholar is trying to convince somebody of something, to correct misunderstandings and set the record straight. But I think there's something structural that we need to point to. It's the battle that's staged here between the ideal ego and the ego ideal, between how one would like to appear to oneself, as for example this autonomous revolutionary anarchist, and on the other hand how one believes one appears to the big other. In other words, as a bomb-throwing anarchist or as a white male heterosexual, blah, blah, blah. So I think the key point then that I'm really trying to make through all of this is just to say that anarchist discourse perpetuates, anarchist studies discourse perpetuates the metonymic displacement of lack, a refusal to engage with lack, within the signifying structure of university discourse through the logic of abnegation with the interplay of the ideal ego and ego ideal. Okay, I realize I'm over my time, but this one last thing I want to say. It's just that I do think that the university is something that's worth holding on to in the end. It does offer us 4 walls, which Lacan would call a body, and the body is something we can't do without. But I think we nonetheless have reason to be suspicious. I don't believe that we are paying enough attention to what Lacan said in his 15th seminar, quote, it is obvious that the principle of university teaching is precisely that anything whatsoever in anything that touches on the most burning subjects, indeed current politics, for example, all of this should be presented. It should be put into circulation, precisely in such a way that it is of no importance. The fact is that it is tolerable in that whatever is professed in it does not involve any disorder, end quote. So I think in the end, this is what anarchist studies is, without realizing itself, doing. So that I'll just stop there, although I had more. And just to continue what I'm saying, I would make a comment on Saul's presentation as a way of opening up discussion. When you were discussing voluntary servitude, la bosse, I don't know how to pronounce it. I just know it from reading your books. Okay, la bosse. And its counterpart, voluntary inservitude. I sort of took note of that, and I thought, you know, this is like one of my basic truth tables. I say, okay, there's voluntary servitude, there's voluntary inservitude. Now there's involuntary inservitude, and there's involuntary servitude. So if we begin with voluntary servitude here, I think what we have is basically university discourse. I think it basically mimics entirely the structure of university discourse. With voluntary inservitude, what I think we have is voluntary here means etymologically, I believe it's close to the word wish or will, or which, you know, psychoanalysts would say is close to desire. So it's a desire for freedom, a willful desire, a sort of willful desire for inservitude, to break from the master. So I think this mirrors in some ways the hysterics discourse, which is, again, really a revolutionary discourse. But I think what's missing in this truth table is, to begin with, the third one, involuntary inservitude. Involuntary servitude. With involuntary servitude, I think this is what the analyst discourse begins with. It's basically, this was Freud's intervention. Freud says, against conscious intentions, wills, what you think you desire, and so on. Even when we think we're acting free, let's demonstrate that we're not. So this was, I think, post-anarchism's intervention into anarchist theory itself, and what anarchist theory became through its adaptation of anarchist studies discourse. So here we have the analyst discourse. And then there's what comes after the analyst discourse, which is involuntary inservitude. If involuntary servitude, as the analyst discourse points out, how we are slaves even and especially when we think that we are not, then involuntary inservitude, I think, is that act, the psychoanalytic act. There's a number of ways of putting it, I think. There's also the traversal of the fundamental fantasy. In other words, when we are not only consciously anti-capitalist and anti-state and so on, but when we've also changed the very structure of our discourse so that our unconscious thinks we're anti-capitalist too. So the reversal of voluntary servitude, I don't think, it's just my personal thing, I don't think the reversal is, or the opposite discourse is voluntary inservitude. I think the opposite discourse is finally a passage through involuntary servitude, finally to arrive at involuntary inservitude. So that's everything I have to say. I'm sorry for rambling for so long. It's been 35 minutes. Apologies.
Okay, well let's go ahead and open it up to the group. Who would like to respond? I don't know if Saul wants to maybe respond briefly to Dwayne's last statement there, or if we should. Looks like you might want to, so let's do that. It looks like you are muted still, though. Saul, for some reason we're not hearing you. Would you mind leaving the Hangout and coming right back in? I'll send you the Hangout link on Facebook. I'm sure that would fix it if you don't mind doing that. I just sent you the Hangout link on Facebook. If you don't mind jumping out and jumping right back in. So we'll just give him a chance to come back in. Meanwhile, Dwayne, could you say a little bit about this concept of involuntary inservitude?
Involuntary inservitude. I mean, honestly, it was something I was just playing with while I was listening to his presentation, Saul's presentation. I was just thinking, well, we've got a number of structural possibilities as soon as we begin by saying that there can be some reversals. I lost my notes where I wrote this, but oh, here it is. So I think that, ultimately the master's discourse, as I put it, in Lacan puts it, I think ultimately it's a discourse that nobody really speaks, and yet it speaks through us. So while some people say that obsession is part of the master's discourse, for example, I don't think it is. I think obsession is ultimately, and Lacan agreed. I think he said obsession is common among the intelligentsia, and so here he's linking, in a sense, university discourse and obsession. So So I don't think that the master's discourse maps out. I don't think voluntary servitude is part of the master's discourse. Instead, I was just mapping the hysterics, the university, the analysts, and then what I would call as something like a truly revolutionary or post-analytic discourse. What comes after what, what comes after the act, what comes after the traversal of the fantasy, what comes after the pass, or to put it in anarchist terms, what comes after the revolution.
Right. Yeah. I guess for me, I'm thinking of it through through Deleuze's work on Proust, where he talks about involuntary memory, and he basically says that only when it's only when something triggers our memory involuntarily that we're actually able to access the unconscious. If you try to access the unconscious, it doesn't work. But we can go back to that later. Let's move on to Paul.
Am I back on now?
Yes.
Am I back on now?
Yes.
You can hear me, can you?
Yes.
Okay, good. I just wanted to say a few words in regards to what Dwayne's very interesting psychoanalytical Lacanian reading of anarchism. I would say actually that the involuntary servitude, I would associate that more with the position of the hysteric, actually. I mean, I've written a paper precisely on this this question, which I think is coming out in the book published by Nathan Jewin, the anthology of anarchism. I have a chapter on anarchism and psychoanalysis, and I try to also think about anarchism in terms of Lacan's four discourses. So I suppose what I would say is that I mean, I would tend to associate voluntary inservitude with the position of the analyst. So my point actually is that I see the revolutionary hysteric as someone who always identifies with his or her own oppression, his or her own domination. So in that case, the state or sort of external forces of power and domination become not only kind of a point of identity, so one sort of identifies oneself in opposition to these forces which supposedly deny you freedom, but they also operate as a kind of an excuse, or kind of a cover to hide behind, or a sort of an excuse for impotency, it's an excuse for a certain kind of inaction or inability to act, right? So my point would be that to move beyond that, which is into the position of the analyst, that we have to realize that we actually have the power all along. That these kinds of external forces, which we which we kind of endow with so much kind of imaginary power, are indeed kind of illusory forces. So I mean that's how I kind of understand that sort of relationship actually between the hysteric and the master on the one hand, and the intervention of the analyst. The intervention of the analyst is precisely to reveal to us our ontological freedom, is to reveal to us the fact of non-power, or the fact that, as I would put it, power does not exist. That the kind of the projection of power is simply a kind of excuse, or a sort of a way of preventing us from acting. I mean, I have quite a lot to say actually about Dwayne's paper, which I found extremely interesting actually, but perhaps I'll let him respond to that. So you can mute me again, I suppose.
No, I think I see where you're coming from. Oh, I'm getting some feedback. Okay, there we go. And I don't really have too much to add. I think I find it entirely agreeable. I was just provoked by what you had to say, and I thought, let's see how far we can take it. So when I think about the analyst discourse, I think about it as it's not a revolution for us. It's a revolution for the other, for the big other. So the analyst is the counterpoint who occupies the position of our desire. And so I think this is why Max Stirner, for example, Sergei Nakiev, who I'm You know, I have no shame saying he's one of my favorite within the lineage of classical to modern anarchism. That these people, I don't think we should see them for what they were, but for what they were for us. And when we look at it this way, we see that they are nothing. They offer themselves as nothing. Sergei Nakiev, for example, begins his catechisms of anarchist catechisms or catechism of a revolutionary. I always get it confused with Bakunin's, but he begins it by saying basically the revolutionary is a doomed man. He has no, no morals, no friends, no. I have it somewhere here. No attachments, no property, no name. Everything in him is wholly absorbed in the single passion for the revolution. And here I think what we should do is we should read it alongside the discourse of the analyst. Because what he's doing, I think, is that he's saying that the analyst, if he truly wants to bring about something like a revolution, then he shouldn't attempt to occupy the position of this sort of love object within a transferential relationship, the fraternal brother, for example, or the maternal love object, or the paternal authority figure who knows everything, or whatever. This isn't the position he should occupy. He shouldn't occupy the position of somebody who sort of transmits the morals and demands of a neoliberal order, or the morals and demands of the anarchist platform on this and that. And he shouldn't be the employee or servant of the person whom he's dedicated a significant amount of energy to revolutionizing their discourse. What he should occupy is the place of the analyst's single passion for the revolution of her or his prevailing discourse. And that passion it's the place of lack. It's the place of desire. And so it's what Lacan called the lack of relation. So it's not about relating to the other and so on. It's about avoiding compensations, the compensation of love, the compensation of morality, and the compensation of demands made however. It's, I think, ultimately about trying to bring about a revolution that a revolutionary himself can't bring about. This is why Sergei Nakiev created, I think, ultimately those hidden, Bakunin was involved in this too, and many of the early classical anarchists, this very clandestine group. They infiltrated Masonic circles and so on. And so there was this sort of invisible element to it, out of sight. And I think finally, this is what Lacan meant when he said that, I'm paraphrasing, but he said basically the only truly revolutionary discourse is the analytic discourse, and it's the only one that hasn't yet been appropriated, or as Guy Debord and others would have said, recuperated. It hasn't been transformed into an object of study within the university. I mean, it has been to a certain extent, but that's where it loses its analytic insights. He says that the discourse of the master has only one counterpoint. If you want to break out of mastery, you will only find it in the analytic discourse. I realize this is a really unfashionable thing to say, especially with Slavoj Žižek and others praising the revolutionary capacity of the hysteric structure. But it's the hysteric who will ultimately come to be where the analyst was. So that's, I mean, it's not really directly related to what you're saying. It's only tangentially related, but I think it's nonetheless important, and it's basically, that's the position that I would take.
Okay, let's open this up to. Oh, Saul, did you want to say something more?
Okay, we can open up to general discussion. Actually, that's a good idea.
Okay, yeah. Yeah. So, who would like to do something? Maybe Daniel?
Yeah, I wanted to say some thoughts. I'm sorry, I'm hearing feedback, but thank you for the great presentation. It was really interesting. First of all, I want to touch a bit the, that point which says that we are all becoming anti-capitalists, more or less. That is evident nowadays, and I think that touches on that there is a great internalization, let's say, of affairs of every level, and on that side there is also a becoming state on everyone, as there is a becoming anti-capitalist if we were to take Deleuze and Guattari's notions. Uh, and I'm saying this because you see not only on daily activities and daily talks, people internalizing feelings about the economy, the state, and this kind of attitude leads to inaction, more or less, because anarchism, let's say in the 90s, had direct action as an access to politics, going in the neighborhood, bringing brochures, saying something, and revealing an event that was unknown to everyone. Nowadays, that we know everything, and we can get any kind of information anytime. This practice seems kind of, let's say, incapable of doing what it did. So this voluntarism, let's say that I realize that I'm free and I do not have to obey, um, paradoxically for me produces a sense of guilt that we can see migrating from leftist discourses to the anarchist ones, which relies a lot on the sense of, we could see it as a Christian guilt, like and a helplessness, and the sense that I am this and I'm doing this. It's not what you think, so these are my beliefs and everything is going wrong and it's my fault, more or less. So that would be for me some interesting points for starting, at least. Yeah, I put my headphones back on because I was hearing feedback. So thanks a lot again. I don't know if that made sense. It was very inconsistent, but thank you again.
How about what we do is if somebody wants to talk or respond, just sort of mention it in the comment box on the side, and that way that person will get priority. Is that okay? Does anybody want to respond to that?
Looks like Elmo has something.
Yes, thanks. Thank you both very much for your talks. I have a question about Lacan, so it's for Duane, I guess. I found it very interesting. You mentioned it briefly that he talked at an event with students about the idea of the revolution, and I also read a little bit about it in the link that you posted to the seminar. Lacan's view of the events of May '68 seemed to be very negative, or not very optimistic about what happened and what the students did and the workers. And this I found very interesting because it's a stark contrast to the way that lots of other post-structuralist thinkers relate to these events, especially in the way that histories of post-anarchism, for example, will explain where post-structuralism came from. They will always refer to the events of May '68. So to me, the fact that Lacan had this very different negative opinion of these events raises the question of whether there is some incompatibility, maybe even there, between Lacan and other thinkers that post-anarchists use. So could one even say that post-anarchists have to make a choice at some point between Lacan and other French theory, or do you not see a problem there?
I'll try and answer a little bit, and then I'll ask Saul what he thinks, because he's been writing about Lacan much longer than I have. In fact, it was his earlier book, From Bakunin to Lacan, and along with Richard Day's book, Gramsci is Dead, that really solidified the fact that Lacan was somebody worth taking serious. So I think Saul might want to respond in a moment, but I would say I think. Rather than answering by saying that you should or shouldn't make a choice, what I think is important is that today we are, I think, more than ever afraid of dogma. We're afraid of people who are fixed to particular thinkers. And so as a result, much of what gets passed in anarchist studies books and in radical literature, it comes across as what people like to call bricolage. You know, taking this and that from the junk pile and sort of making a big collage out of it and so on. But you know, one of the things Lacan taught me is to come to know your master, and Lacan is a master in many respects. But nonetheless, I think you point out something interesting, a limitation of the master, perhaps a lack in Lacan. It would be a theory of the event. May 68. I think the problem with Lacan is that he too much remains within the symbolic level. You know, ultimately, and I think Zizek here as well it's part of his great problem. You know, he recently came out with a book on the event, and he's trying to come up with his own. It's just a little book, and it's just really a little event that he has in the end. But I think the thing is not to make a choice. Refuse to make a choice. But nonetheless, don't be afraid to be dogmatic. And what I mean by that is my work ultimately moves within three registers, and they correspond very clearly to the registers of the imaginary, symbolic, and real. What we have in the imaginary dimension is a really nice theory of style. We can call it revolutionary style. The way that Lacan taught us how to deal with lures, traps, imaginary spectacles, and so on. And so that would be a nice revolutionary theory that's situated within the imaginary. Now, at the level of the symbolic, we have something that Zizek and Lacan would have called a traversal of the fantasy, or something like that. And it's basically it functions by accepting the lack within the symbolic, and finally presenting something new. So in the end, it's basically the position I took in what I presented. But I think that there's another position, and thankfully, Alain Badiou and his student Quentin Malestou and others, I think were right to bring this dimension, and it's the dimension of the real as real, what Badiou would have called being qua being, and this is the dimension of the event. And the reason why I think Lacan could not come to accept something like May 68 being a rupture, the consequences of which we would have to come to be responsible for in one way or another, was because he really lacked a nice theory of the event. And this is, I think, ultimately what we can find in Alain Badiou's work. But I don't think it's proper to pit thinkers against each other so much. Or it's not necessarily proper to say why one particular thinker is the great thinker, but it's rather to find the different places that revolution can happen within a given structure, or from outside of that structure. So if we're talking about a pure politics of the outside, to put it in something like Saul Newman's words, I think ultimately I don't think we can deny it. It's Alain Badiou. He offers this, and the anarchist refusal to engage with Badiou because of his Maoism or his early Maoism and all this stuff. I think it's really it's our own downfall. We need to engage with it, and we need to move beyond it and do something maybe better than it. So that would be my response. I don't know, Saul?
Saul, can you try to unmute yourself? Saul, I hate to ask you to do this again, but if you jump out and jump back in again, I really do think that'll fix it. Saul's using a computer that's about 10 years old, and I'm not saying that to be embarrassing or anything like that. It's just that basically older computers very often have this issue. So.
Hello.
Yes, there we go. What did you do just now?
I had to restart it. I mean, is there a way to, when I click on the unmute button, it doesn't unmute. That's the problem.
Yeah, it's
probably because my computer. Is there a way for you to do it for me? Can you unmute me? Because I don't seem to be able to unmute myself.
I'm having the exact same problem
Right.
with your. I'm having that problem with your profile specifically, but not with others.
Yeah. Okay, so it's
I,
probably because my computer's a real piece of junk actually, and it's very old and it's very slow. So I don't know what's going on. I'm sorry. This it sounds a bit it's a bit disruptive, isn't it, with these kinds of problems? But I'm not sure if the discussion's moved on. If you wanted me to respond to some of the things that Dwayne was saying in relation to Lacan and May '68.
Yes, please respond to
Okay. So I mean, I'll just say that I think Lacan's relationship to May '68 and to kind of revolutionary politics is quite ambivalent, actually. I mean, on the one hand, he was actually quite politically supportive of many of the students' struggles. On the other hand, there is a kind of a sort of I suppose a pessimism or a skepticism about revolutionary politics and revolutionary utopianism, which was shared by Freud as well, of course. From Freud talks about his sort of part conversion to Bolshevism. Says something that he agrees with the Bolsheviks that the first 2 decades after the revolution will be sort of blood, sweat, and tears, but he doesn't agree with the kind of the idea that there's going to be a sort of utopia or a perfect society at the end of that. So I mean, I suppose my own interpretation of Lacan's famous or infamous saying that what you want is another master is really to, I suppose, usher in or introduce a sort of a word of warning to revolutionists, that which is to say that they need to be aware of their own sort of if you like hidden authoritarian desires, their own desire for mastery, their own desire to become the new master. I mean, in a way, it's sort of a word of warning to the destiny or the fate which has befallen so many revolutions in the past, which is to simply fall into the trap or the place of power. I suppose we'd say that with hindsight, he was partly right, wasn't he? Because some of the sort of the decentralized impulses that motivated May '68 later became sort of the impulse for for sort of neoliberalism, for instance. So it's a very sort of ambivalent question, but I was quite struck by Dwayne's point about coming to know one's own master, right? Essentially, I think that's what Lacan is saying. And, come to know your own master. Come to know that you might, talking to the revolutionists, you might become or want to become or secretly desire to become the new master. But perhaps there's also here once again a question of the place of discipline or self-discipline here, which goes back to my point. That in other words, if one wants to avoid being mastered, and if one wants to avoid the desire to become the new master, which I think are like two sides of the same subjective mechanism, then one needs to firstly be aware of these sorts of authoritarian tendencies, which one may not appear to have been aware of, and also one needs to be able to some degree master oneself. Right. So yeah, I mean, I suppose that's. Oh, sorry, I just wanted to ask Dwayne one question actually before I forget, which is to do with the event. You've spoken about the importance of anarchists, coming to terms or engaging with Alain Badiou and the notion of the event, despite his predilections toward Maoism and other some pleasant forms of revolutionary politics in the past. But I think I'd like to get a better sense from you, Dwayne, about what you see as the importance of the event for anarchism. I mean, what is the anarchist event? Is it the revolution of Bakunin and Kropotkin, or is it something else? I'm a bit skeptical, I have to say, about the notion of the event. Actually, I don't think there is one event. I don't think there is one political event. I think that's been the problem of many sorts of many kinds of the whole, if you like, the whole sort of revolutionary imaginary of the past, which I think is perhaps no longer really functions. So what is the event for you? Thank you.
That's a tough question. I mean, I think that on the one hand, we know what the event is for certain thinkers, namely Zizek, Badiou, and that crowd. However, I'm not sure what I would say if there has been an anarchist event. I'm obviously much more cynical, and it's much easier to point out that and demonstrate that many of the things we thought were events were not. But what I'm talking about when I talk about event is a theory of the event, and what I mean by that is simply a belief that perhaps a revolution, something if you want to call it, if you want to put it in the terms of revolution, something like a revolution can happen without at all our our activity, without our involvement in it. It's something that provokes us from absolutely outside. It comes out of nowhere. And I think on the one hand, there is a tradition of anarchist thought. I don't know how far back it might go, but I can point to a contemporary tradition of the event in a way, and it's from the nihilist communist tradition, namely Dupont, the Dupont brothers. They're not. I mean, they kind of have a cult following, but they have this. For example, one particular essay where they say, "Imagine yourself as an agent from the future." There's no reason you should have to be frantically active. You have to go and try and produce revolutions everywhere all the time. But there's also no reason that you should just stick around, waiting for something like a revolution to happen. This is one of the misinterpretations of the event. An event isn't something that you produce. You are not the master of an event. We are not masters of events. And also, we are not waiting for some guarantee for an event to come. In other words, as one person who interprets Badiou in the anarchist tradition puts it, make ourselves sort of hospitable to an event to come. That's not it at all. I think all it means is that we should be aware that we can be thrown radically off course from everything we thought that was revolutionary, and that it isn't just a revolution in terms of something that the structure itself brings out of us, but something that comes from absolutely outside of the structure. I don't know what that is. It's absolutely vague, and this is exactly why I think we need more of an engagement with the theory of the event. So all of that is simply to say I don't really have an answer.
So it looked like we had a question from Daniel.
Yes, thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yep, because my camera is not working properly, so I don't know if you can hear me. Hello?
We can hear you.
Oh,
I can
okay,
hear you.
thanks. Thank you. I guess my question here is for Saul, because I was thinking about what you were talking about servitude. Well, this kind of concept of voluntary servitude of powers and illusion, and you know, this like I don't know how to put it, like virtuality of power is reinforced every day when we kind of obey to its command voluntarily. But I haven't read Richard Day's book, Gramsci is Dead, so maybe he would answer my question. But how do you propose that kind of thing without engaging with Gramsci's wider concept of consensus? Of building hegemony through civil society, like a more structural approach in which obedience to power is also built by institutions and by like a slow historical process of building consensus, and not just like, I don't know if I'm getting right I'm understanding quite properly your idea, but like only this kind of voluntaristic obedience to power. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you. I think we can't hear you.
Okay.
We can hear you now. We can actually hear you now, Saul. Uh, Saul, just to let you know, I think you might have muted yourself and unmuted yourself. And what I'm trying to do now to mitigate this problem is to just use the volume, which I have access to, and I don't think you have access to. So I've turned your volume all the way up. If you unmute yourself, it should work.
It's okay now. I reconnected, and the feedback is gone.
Okay, thanks, Vince. We're just trying to get Saul's audio to work. I hate to ask this, but would you mind jumping out and jumping back in again? And from here on out, once we get your audio working, please don't mute yourself, and I won't mute you either. And we'll just use the volume approach, and I'll run that, and hopefully that'll keep it working.
Well, I think I'm hearing something there. I think Dwayne was the one who referenced Richard Day's book, so I don't know if you could like comment something about what I just said. I'd appreciate that.
Unfortunately, when you were talking, I was getting a lot of feedback, so I couldn't. Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, of course, certainly. I was just talking about how do we avoid this question when Saul was talking about voluntarily serving, voluntarily having obedience to power. How do we avoid this question of Gramscian analysis? You know, about building consensus and hegemony through slow historical processes that do not necessarily, or in a sense that subject people and build like states of mind or subjects that are constructed, you know, in ways that do not necessarily depend on their own agency. Yeah, that was basically the question.
Okay. Well I
People hear
think
me
Saul's
now?
back.
Okay, can people hear me now? Hello?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, great. Okay, sorry, I'm just tuned out there, of course, but so the question was to do with Gramsci's theory of hegemony. I mean, I sort of caught the last part, actually. I mean, I think the point I would make is that it's always to do with our own agency. It's just that sometimes we forget this. So I think the whole point about the voluntary servitude thesis, according to Lavoisier, is to kind of remind us that in a way we are, in a sense, always responsible to some degree for our own domination, and that it simply can't be put down to questions of ideological false consciousness or being deceived about the nature of things or the, the effect of the media or the effect of various kinds of social institutions, and all of these kinds of infrastructures, these sort of hegemonic infrastructures, ultimately still depend upon this basic basic sort of act of obedience, this basic sort of acquiescence, whether it's tacit or sort of explicit. But my point and Lavoisier's point, of course, is that this is not a sort of a negative statement about human behaviour. This is actually meant to be taken in quite a sort of a positive and sort of emancipatory way. That once again, if these structures of power and domination have been are essentially always supported by us, then they can very easily be undone by us, just by us learning to act and behave differently, in a different kind of way, following different kinds of patterns of behavior. So, so I think, something which underlies all of, Gramsci's theories of consent and hegemony is this kind of basic sort of problem of self-domination. I just think it answers the questions of power much more effectively than Gramsci's theory of hegemony. And of course, the other problem with Gramsci's theory of hegemony is that, the counter side of this is that, the workers, led by the organic intellectuals, have to form their own sort of hegemonic project, which is essentially the project of the Communist Party. So I'm not sure if Gramsci really offers a viable political solution anymore to his own problem.
Do you want to respond to Saul? Daniel?
Yeah, sure. That would be great. Yeah, of course. I was just waiting if you had like I don't know, a different answer to that. I don't have any thoughts really formulated right now, so it was just like a general question.
Oh, okay. Well, on the one hand, I guess my responses are always going to be a little obscure, and I apologize for that. But my first response, and I think I have two. My first one would be that in a sense, what I think we have to completely be rid of, and I'm happy that the anarchist tradition has started to dispose of this sort of tendency toward blueprints. This idea of having a vision of how we can live without a master, having some sort of vision of how we can live in an anarchist society, or how we can properly organize against capitalism and the state and patriarchy and on and on. And I think we need to move away from this. This tendency reached a sort of hyper mode during the time of participatory economics, when it was really fashionable. Noam Chomsky was endorsing it, and you remember I used to own an anarchist cafe that we said it ran off of participatory economic principles. You want to know how that works? It's basically every minute, every second of your day is built making consensus decisions about everything from who's changing the toilet paper to the temperature of the air. You have this proper reverse federation, as the classical anarchists put it, and so I think the first thing we need to do is dispose of visions of the future and ways to properly organize. Completely get rid of that, because what it demonstrates is that we think that there's somebody out there who has the answer. When we dispose of this vision, we're disposing of what Lacan called the subject supposed to know. Nobody knows, none of us. Nobody knows how to organize. Nobody knows how to live without a master. In fact, I would highly recommend that if you haven't seen it already, you should watch the movie The Master. It's I think one of what's that actor's name? He committed suicide. Philip Seymour Hoffman. It's one of his really good last movies, where in the final scene he's in a conversation with the head of quasi-Scientology. And is everybody getting feedback from me? No? Okay. And so what's happening is Joaquin Phoenix is in a discussion with his master, and he says, "I'm going to leave all this," and he's going to go to basically, if I'm paraphrasing, he's going to go to the pure outside of absolute freedom. Here we have Joaquin Phoenix as the perfect hysterical anarchist type. In fact, the master calls him a person who knows how to, a freewheeling person. And the master responds to him, and I think it's at this point that the master said something right. He said, "Once you realize how to live without a master, come and let the rest of us know. Because you'll be the first one in the history of civilization to have done it." So that's my first response, and it leads to my second. My second response is, instead of trying to understand how why subjects are subjected, we need to understand that a subject is always subjected. And this is a point I think Saul Newman made really well in the first part of his new book on post-anarchism when he quoted Foucault. Subjects are always subjected. So when we're trying to figure out what a subject is, we should realize that a subject is, first of all, always split. A subject is always split between the chain of signifiers. And so you can think of it as being a split subject is a subject who is torn from either end brutally by one signifier at one side and another signifier at the other, and almost dismembered. So a subject is ultimately always a split subject. So that's the first thing we have to come to accept, what a subject is. And then we come to this notion of the pure subject, which I think can only be arrived at finally through what I elaborated in analytic discourse. So I guess that's my ultimate answer to your question.
So our next question is from Denise, and then we have a question from Matthew after Denise.
Give me 1 sec. How about now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, great. First of all, thank you very much to Dwayne, Jason, and Saul. I guess my question is a tactical one, and maybe it's directed at Saul. I'd just like to inquire, I guess, about the statement that you made about freedom being something that we always already have, or that the individual always already has. And I was wondering, to what extent is it true, or to what extent is it possible that we can forget about power relations, in the sense that I tend to see the subject as something that is constituted as an effect of power relations. And I think this speaks to the question of why we can't have a blueprint of what an anarchist society would look like, or why we can't have knowledge of, what will happen after the revolution, yada yada yada, or what the revolution will look like. It's because our knowledge is an effect of certain power relations. And so if we try to extrapolate from the knowledge that we have now, we're going to reproduce the same kinds of power relations in the future, or in that blueprint. And so it creates this kind of circle of reproducing the same kinds of hierarchies, or the same kinds of hegemonic forces, I suppose. So my question is, I guess it speaks to that. To what extent can we resist extrapolating or carrying with us these kinds of hegemonic forces that I think constitute us, even if we're split between a sort of hegemonic constitution and a free constitution?
Can people hear me?
Yes.
You can hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Is it okay now?
Yeah.
Okay, fine. So, yeah, I mean, I'm trying to sort of join together your point, of course, is that you're taking a sort of podium point that you're essentially constituted by power relations, and so therefore the risk is that when we sort of project into the future, or when we try to think about a different kind of society, a post-liberation society, for instance, we somehow sort of carry these effects of our sort of constitutional by power interest in society. We kind of simply reproduce the forms of power which is supported by us. I mean, I suppose I make 2 points about that really. One of which is that I think the lesson we should take from Foucault is that the resistance to freedom is actually, if you like, ontologically primary. So once again, even though Foucault is often thought about as a theorist of kind of power and domination and the way that the subject is produced by power, I think this is to just look at what one side of Foucault's thought, and the other side is always, resistance to the possibilities of freedom, the possibilities of. I mean, Foucault talked, say that even in situations of domination, there's always a possibility of little kind of micro reversals. The subject always has the freedom and the capacity to act and think differently, to act and think otherwise. So there's that, and it seems to me that the notion of the insurrection that I'm very interested in, that Max Stirner talks about, is precisely to perform a kind of a work, an ethical work, and a political work upon oneself, such that we can try to sort of, if you like, desubjectify ourselves and subjectify ourselves in different sorts of ways. Right. So when this is the whole notion of freedom as a kind of a practice. It's an ongoing series of ethical practices. It's sort of a work of care of the self, for instance, a certain sort of care for other people. It's never a state that one reaches. It's a kind of a practice, and it's a practice which will carry through into any kind of society. So, I mean, I suppose I simply take the Foucauldian point that there's always going to be power relations. I suppose in any kind of society, those power relations can be more or less democratic or allow greater or less degrees of freedom. But the key point is not to finally claim that we've reached a certain state of freedom and liberation, but the idea that that this kind of practice of freedom is something which is always ongoing. It's sort of a constant, labour upon ourselves, and it's a constant kind of work that we do with other people. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
I think that does answer my question. Yeah, and thank you very much for your response. I'd just like to add maybe one thing, building on the previous question that was asked about Richard Day's book, Gramsci is Dead, because I think there are some parallels with what you're saying in terms of like work on oneself as discipline. In that book, Gramsci is Dead, Richard Day builds a genealogy of the logic of affinity as a kind of counter to or in opposition to the logic of hegemony that we find in Gramsci and in vanguardist Marxist histories. And I think that there's something there once we kind of abandon the blueprint model or the I guess even to an extent the revolutionary model of anarchism and focus on, I guess, more of an affinity model, more of a model of discipline, more of a model of working on oneself or working on ourselves in new formations would be, in a certain sense, the tactical key to producing new kinds of subjects which don't carry their hegemonic power relations into the future, because they would become less and less constituted by them the more and more time they spend in affinity groups, I guess. But yeah, that's about it.
Can you hear me again now? Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. No, I was just simply going to say, of course, that I very much agree with that point. Sometimes, of course, affinity groups can have their own problems and their own restrictions, and so I'm having had some experience with affinity groups. I think there is and also this whole sort of obsession actually with consensus decision making can be sometimes quite problematic. But you know, I mean, I suppose the key point I really take from Foucault really is political experimentation. You know, the importance really of just always trying to sort of innovate and develop, you know, ethical practices of freedom and autonomy, you know, which are always possible in a situation.
Okay, let's move on to Matthew.
Hi, I'm interested in the way the micro and macro politics come together in this conversation. So it seems that there's a lot of focus, or maybe a change to the focus on the micro. So how can we, trying to read this off my screen, so it seems a key turn in post-anarchist ideology is that we're not working towards a utopic revolution. Does this undermine the importance of protesting, political tactics, etc., as is commonly talked about? To me, it doesn't seem to. It seems like it's almost compartmentalizing in a way. Is there something inherently disempowering of the individual in these acts? Yeah. So it's kind of like looking at what Denise said and reversing it and saying that there is a power relation in taking on the identity of being an activist, where the individual learns to see themselves as a new place in society and take on new agency, and consider maybe for the first time autonomous societal organizations. So is there a way where the micro and macro come together? I know that yeah, that's my question. I could re-clarify it if I need to.
I've turned Saul's volume back up, so it should work. Is it not working, Saul? Okay.
My answer is very obscure. Okay, so I don't think this will really answer your question, but it might touch on it a little bit. One of the things I think is very interesting to follow the way that post-anarchism has actually moved since its inception, and we can debate when it began. Some people would say it began, in the late 1990s. Some people would say with Hakim Bey in the 1980s. Some people would say with Rainer Scherman before that. You can keep going. And some people would say it began with classical anarchism itself. But if you begin with the basic narrative, the way it works, and I'll get to the micro-macro thing, or I'll try to, is that when we read the classical tradition, and we could only ever read the classical anarchist tradition from the present, when post-anarchists read it, we discovered that there was a sort of latent ontological, what we called essentialism, a belief in the naturally creative power of humanity, and so on. And then, so that's a sort of ontological essentialism. And then at the level of strategy, or what I would call epistemology for particular reasons, there was more of something like a hegemonic orientation in terms of truth claims. So what we had was a sort of, there are a finite amount of powers, or sites of mastery, the state, capitalism, the church, but it's finite. There's relatively few, and power is functioning in one direction, and it's functioning to restrict this essential ontological creativity of humanity. Okay, so that's the basic classical narrative, and this has been critiqued by many people, but notably only by people in the contemporary period. So when post-anarchists raised this characterization, this critique against classical anarchism, people said no, the classical tradition wasn't like that, but they only did so within a particular logical moment, which is the same moment within which post-anarchist discourse is situated. And so for that reason, I think even the critiques of post-anarchism are here part of the post-anarchist tradition. Okay, and then you move to modern, sort of more modern anarchist theory, and what you have is a rejection of ontology. All ontology is thought to be representative, thought to be authoritative, and essentialist. So an intense suspicion of ontology. And this was very clear in post-anarchist discourse. You can see it in Andrew Koch's essay in I think late 1980s, early 1990s, Post-Structuralism and the Epistemological Basis of Anarchism. You see it in Todd May's work. You see it kind of everywhere, right? So a rejection of ontology, and then what does it move toward is a pluralist orientation at the level of strategy, at the level of understanding power. This is where you move from a macro position, macro structures, the state, patriarchy, and these sorts of things, and macro orientations toward revolution, the big capital R revolution, toward the modern tradition where you no longer have an ontological position and it's collapsed into a pluralist position, micro power, micro struggles, affinity networks are emphasized. Why is it that affinity networks were not emphasized so much until Murray Bookchin and others started talking about it? Well, it's because you're in a particular moment in time, a particular logical, historical moment where these claims are situated and where everybody's kind of saying these things. Okay, and this is the moment that post-anarchism intervenes. It intervenes to say, let's reflect on our presuppositions. Let's reflect on our presuppositions. Let's not only be anti-ontological, let's not only logically pluralist, relativist, and at its extreme subjectivist, but let's ask ourselves why we hold these positions. And this is the real intervention. Maybe this is the event in many ways. Because all of a sudden, a moment became open. We could reflect on our tradition in a way which didn't repeat our ontological and epistemological and ultimately meta-ethical presuppositions, which you see repeated timelessly, but where we challenge our own authority structures, our own ways of repeating and our own ways of displacing power. So one of the ways, for example, that we've displaced power, I believe, in the contemporary period, is through the concept of autonomy. The concept of autonomy, if you look at the classical tradition, nobody used it. I mean, if you're really looking for it, you're going to find what looks like a concept of autonomy. You have people talking about things that are no doubt about autonomous practices, but it didn't achieve the dignity of a real anarchist concept until contemporary anarchist studies interpreted it that way. Now, what Max Stirner ultimately demonstrates is that the notion of autonomy is just a displacement of the problem of mastery. It's a displacement from the power of the big other to the power of man, the power of the self-organization of man. And so I think autonomy, you could even, geez, as I'm saying it, I'm realizing there's a homophony in the word autonomy. Autonomy, autonomy, self-naming, auto-self-naming, autonomy. So this leads me finally to say that to talk about the micro and the macro and the relation between them, I think we ultimately have to talk about it in terms of logical moments. I think the next logical moment is finally that we can return to a sort of micro orientation at the level of ontology, which is where everybody is all the philosophers and theorists are at right now. They're talking about ontological multiplicities. Being is a multiplicity, and being is machinic, and so on. And you also see it, I think, I can't remember who it was. Elmo, maybe it was you in Anarchist Developments and Cultural Studies. I can't remember, but in one of the issues, somebody noted that this was Rainer Sherman's position a long time ago, that being is a multiplicity. So finally, we're not saying ontology and being is something that is essential and universal. We're also not anti-ontology like we were in the second moment, but now, finally, we are saying that ontology is a multiplicity. We can only say that today. But that leaves the dimension of strategy and epistemology open. Now, I don't think we are anymore in the time for saying that strategy must be tactical. You know, Todd May's great distinction was, and I think ultimately Richard Day was in this moment too, is a moment where you're breaking the logic of hegemony, or breaking the logic of strategic political philosophy, to put it in Todd May's words, and moving toward tactical political philosophy. Right? Moving toward small-scale struggles against power in this particular location and that particular. We've lost the capital R revolution. Now, finally, after post-anarchism, and this is only possible with the intervention of post-anarchism, we can finally get to the moment of ontological multiplicity and a return to epistemological or strategic universality, a macro orientation, but without its essentialist, reductive, authoritarian presence. So this is how Hegelian dialectics works, right? So we're able to go back to where we started again, but without the stuff we didn't like. But we can only do it with the mode of intervention that post-anarchism brought. So that, I guess that's my basic way of discussing the relationship between macro and micro. Is not to say that it's a pure opposition, but to say that they're each situated within their particular logical moment.
Well, it looks like we're pretty much at the end of the question. We're getting to about 4, so we've been here about what 3.5 hours or 2.5 hours. 1 to 4, I guess about 3 hours. So, you know, we can call it to a close, or I'll leave it up to Dwayne, because this is primarily his event. So. What do you think, Dwayne?
Well, if anybody else wants to talk, I see no reason why they shouldn't amongst each other, or any more questions for Saul? Or Jason, I should add, who was a key player, who still is a key player in post-anarchism.
Yeah, I mean, I've kind of taken a turn around 2009 or so. After the crisis, I kind of took a turn a little more towards Marxism, but I guess I'll turn on the camera for a minute. I don't want to do a long diatribe here, but I basically took a turn, a bit of a more of a Marxist turn, and that happened actually via Maximilian Rubel, and of course just in grad school, there's just so much intersectionality between post-structuralism and Marxism, and just the more I read, the more I became convinced of a more kind of historical materialist type of approach via Marx, but mostly via heterodox Marxists and that sort of thing. But I think that there's an interesting place that post-anarchism can connect with that, and which could almost be defined as actually post-anarchist, especially if you're looking at people such as Maximilian Rubel, who read Marx himself as an anarchist, and who basically say that that the representation of Marx through Engels being his primary expositor was not particularly faithful to what Marx himself actually thought about the state, and or even what he thought about how the transition to full communism should look. Because he famously said in the civil wars in France that the Paris Commune was was the form that the transition should take. So and that's what meant by the dictatorship of the proletariat. So yeah, so to me that type of I think Rubel is very underread, and if you read him closely, what you primarily find is that I mean, who he is. He's basically one of the world's most important anthologists of Marx. He's the main anthologist of Marx in the French language, as far as I know. So so his views on that. I mean, he's coming from the perspective of someone who has just a vast knowledge of all of Marx's texts, of what he was arguing, of how they've been received over the years, and that sort of thing. So to me, there is a place in which anarchism and Marxism kind of become the same thing, and I don't mean that in a vague sense. I mean that in a kind of historiographical sense that is almost entirely unrecognized, but which you can find via Rubel and a few others. So yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at today, and definitely still informed by post-structuralism, primarily Deleuze. I'm not extremely informed by Lacan, but Saul Newman, I'm really glad that he was able to join us today, because Saul's work was one of the first things that made it really clear to me how one could do sort of post-structuralist philosophy as political theory, basically. And because I was very strongly attached to anarchism at that time, this being around 2002, his work played a major role in my process of understanding how those things connect. So I'm really glad that he's here, and I value his work a lot, and Wayne's. So. Anybody else?
Maybe we should end it then.
Can't you hear Vince?
Yeah, did Vince want to say something? Oh, it looks like there's a question from Elmo.
No, I just posted Vince's question because he has some trouble because I think some can't hear him. So I
Oh, wait,
copied it
wait.
on Facebook.
Sorry, Vince, do you want to try now?
Can anybody hear me?
Yeah, we can. I'm sorry, I didn't know you were trying to speak.
Yeah, so I'll just read the question that I posted. My question is in relation to Dwayne's discussion of university discourse. Referring back to your interview with Rancière at ADCS, do you consider para-academic engagement as a form of or a site of anti-authoritarian struggle, or in Todme as a tactical intervention, that is to say, a rupture or break from the academic logos? If so, do you think this points to or opens to a sort of aporia for a post-anarchist moment, whether or not that moment is occurring within a future continuum or some other sort of viewing the history of anarchism, either whether it's from a linear classical to post-anarchist relationship, or if it sort of triangulates into a post-anarchist moment.
Was this question for Saul or for Dwayne?
For Dwayne.
Oh, thank you, Vince. Honestly, I don't really know. I've been personally back and forth on this question for a while. On the one hand, I think para-academia as a phenomenon has occurred precisely when the neoliberal university needed it to. And I know that's a fairly easy argument, but when serious thought doesn't happen in the university anymore, people end up going to secondary places for it. On the other hand, to me it seems fairly obvious that the places like the New Center and that other place that I refuse to mention, but also including, I think, the European Graduate School, if I can include that as a sort of para-academic institution. On the one hand, it's very obvious that they're drawing a certain type of student. It's not the student of university discourse. I think it's very obvious that we're not dealing with students that are speaking the university discourse. The type of students and people that are having seminars at the New Center, that other place that I refuse to mention, and the European Graduate School, these are people that, to put it in the words of somebody in the chat earlier, I think it was Daniel, it's a form of experimentation. That they're speaking a more experimental discourse. There's something different going on here. These are people that I think do not quite feel at home in the traditional university as it stands today. And so in a sense, they feel a bit like refugees, or they feel a little bit like the refuse of the university. We came to university, to higher education, to think, and to think militantly, and nowhere can we seem to find a space to do that. And so we go to university, and then we feel like the refuse, and then we go to these para-academic places. So I think in one sense we could make an argument that here the refuse is the agent of the discourse of these para-academic models. The refuse, of course, always being objet petit a. And when the refuse is the agent of the discourse, you know you're in something like an analytic discourse. So I think there's something going on here. On the other hand, there's something that really scares me about para-academia. And I wonder if, and it's just a thought experiment, if it's, when I say it's exactly what the neoliberal institution required, if it's a way of keeping people happy within the traditional university. So instead of airing their discontent within the institution, they're sort of sublimating it out here into these great projects. So that's pretty much what I would say there.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, Saul. Thanks again to Saul for being here. I mean, it was on short notice. He has another lecture to give in, I think, 2 days on his book, and he had some technological difficulties and so on. So I really appreciate it. I'm sure we all really appreciate it. And also thanks to Jason for setting this up for us.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This was really great. All right. Well, hopefully we can have another one of these sometime on maybe some other intersection of thoughts and ideas through post-anarchism. One thing I'd really like to do is maybe post-anarchism and post-Marxism, a type of like what are actually the ways in which they might intersect and that sort of thing. But great. So thanks everybody, and thanks Dwayne. Thank you, Saul, and everybody who showed up. And we'll see you next time.